Welcome to Lecture 1 for Hebrew 1 and 2, Bright Old Testament 502-504 Online Edition. My name is Kyle Ferguson, and I will be your professor for the next several weeks as we study together elementary Hebrew. Each class will begin with an online lecture that you should watch as many times as necessary in order to solidify the material. After watching the material in the online lecture, you can then use the Quizlets that are linked on Canvas in order to solidify the material. From there, you will go on to the workbook. Although there are separate videos that go through the workbook, you will go through the exercises in the workbook, again solidifying the material that you have learned in the Quizlets and that you've learned in these online lectures. I'm looking forward to a great semester, so let's go ahead and jump in. Here are the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, or more accurately, Aleph-Bet, since alphabet is based upon the terminology of the Greek alphabet, beginning with alpha and beta, and the Hebrew alphabet begins with aleph and bet, so Aleph-Bet. The Hebrew text uses the block square script adopted from the Aramaic language after the Babylonian exile through the influence of Aramaic within the Persian Empire. This script replaced earlier scripts of Hebrew that were a bit more difficult to decipher. The current script is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Aramaic of course, and is even used today in modern Hebrew. There are no vowels in the Hebrew alphabet because Hebrew, like most Semitic languages, never wrote vowels. Roughly 1,000 years ago, marks were added to the Hebrew text to note vowel sounds, but there technically is no such thing as a Hebrew vowel, just 22 consonants. Of course, if you count this list, you'll see that there are 23 consonants. That's because the last two in the bottom of the right-hand column are technically the same letter, just used to indicate two different sounds. The one with the dot over the left-hand side is sin, pronounced s. The one with the dot over the right-hand side is shin, pronounced sh. A good way to remember this is that sin is never right. Thus, the one with the dot over the right-hand side must be shin. Two letters in the Hebrew alphabet have no sound: Aleph, the first letter of the Aleph-Bet, and Ayin. Each letter of the alphabet makes the sound of the beginning of the letter's name. For instance, the letter sin makes a s sound, and the letter shin makes a sh sound. Aleph and Ayin, however, do not make any sound at all, so they don't make the sound at the beginning of their name. Instead, they will take whatever sound is accompanying them, indicated by the vowel sound that should be associated with them within the text. This has always been the purpose of Aleph, to represent a vowel. Ayin, on the other hand, may have had some sound way back in the past, and in some Semitic languages, like Arabic, still does, but Ayin has lost any phonetic value in Hebrew. One other letter to note is the sixth letter down in the left-hand column. This is the letter Waw or Vav. Scholars continue to debate which is correct, a W sound or a V sound. Some claim that the V sound comes from the influence of German. Others claim that the W sound is assumed incorrectly in Hebrew because Arabic still pronounces this letter as wow. Today's scholars, regardless of which they choose, are hopelessly inconsistent. Many scholars, including myself, pronounce this letter as Vav with a V sound, which is how I will pronounce it in this class, and yet we still say God's personal name with a W pronunciation, way instead of ve, even though the rest of the time I use the V sound. Really, it doesn't matter that much, as long as you try to remain as consistent as possible. Either pronounce the letter as a W all the time or a V all the time. Don't go back and forth because that's just sloppy, with the one exception being God's name, of course, if you choose a V pronunciation. So that's the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Learn the names of the letters, learn the sounds that they make, or at least in the case of Aleph and Ayin, the sounds that they don't make. A helpful song for learning the names can be found online, linked from Canvas. I will spare you, though, and not attempt to sing it for you here. Remember that Hebrew is written from right to left, not left to right as in English. This is true of many Semitic languages, but not all of them. Ugaritic actually goes left to right, as in English, but Hebrew, as well as Arabic and several others, is written from right to left. Thus, you will open your Hebrew Bible on what we would consider the back cover and work your way to the left, rather than vice versa. Just to be difficult, 5 of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet have a different form if they appear at the end of a word. You'll notice here the 5, Kaf, Mem, Nun, Pe, and Tzadeh, all have a form that exists in the middle of the word, which is the form that you see under regular form, and a final form that occurs at the end of the word. Sometimes then we refer to these as final Kaf, final Mem, final Nun, final Pe, and final Tzadeh. You'll notice that of the 5, 4 of them have a line that extends below the normal written line. Thus, Kaf looks an awful lot like Dalet, but you'll notice in the example column, where you see the word Derek, that the Dalet has a shorter line than the final Kaf. Final Kaf is also convenient in that it will usually have a symbol inside of the Kaf, which is not shown here, but this also will help you differentiate between Kaf and Dalet. Just remember that final Kaf, final Nun, final Pe, and final Tzadeh have that line, that foot, that extends below the line. Final Mem simply becomes more of a block version of the letter Mem as it appears in the middle of a word. 6 of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet have 2 pronunciations. We sometimes refer to these 2 pronunciations as strong and weak, or hard and soft. The technical terms are plosive, think explosive, and fricative, think in terms of friction, which produces that second sound. You can see the second historical sound listed in the second line of each example here in red. However, most Hebrew scholars today only worry about the different pronunciations for beit and pei, the first and fifth example. The second pronunciation is a V for beit, almost like a vav, and a PH or a F pronunciation for pei. The difference between the 2 pronunciations is indicated by the presence or absence of a dot, which is technically called a dagesh line. Dagesh is found in numerous situations, but only these 6 examples will take the technical dagesh line, showing that the hard pronunciation or that plosive pronunciation should be used. This pronunciation is typically used at the beginning of a syllable or after a long vowel. Simply keep in mind that this is why you're seeing a dagesh in all of these letters, even though the pronunciation is really only changed for our concern in beit and pei. 5 letters within the Hebrew alphabet need to be highlighted as gutturals: aleph, he, chet, and ayin. The technical term for these is actually laryngals and pharyngals, but that is a phonetic term and really doesn't address our issue here. Our issue has to do with the fact that these 4 letters act differently within Hebrew words than other letters. We'll explain the differences in a future lesson. For now, you just need to know that when there seems to be a problem in a word, one of these 4 letters is probably responsible. Resh is another letter that sometimes acts like a guttural, although technically it is not. Resh you can almost think of as the little brother that wants to hang out with the cool kids. So sometimes he tags along and acts like a guttural, sometimes he acts like a normal letter. It all depends on what kind of mood he's in. So simply remember the 4 gutturals and sometimes resh. This is a chart of the Hebrew vowels. As you may remember, I said that there is no such thing as a Hebrew vowel, and that's correct. Hebrew vowels don't technically exist. Instead, 1,000 years ago, a group of scribes known as the Masoretes added some markings to the Hebrew text to indicate vowel pronunciation. So technically, these are not vowels, these indicate vowel sounds. These are not actual letters, these are actually the markings that were used by a group of Masoretes that lived in a region known as Tiberias. So we often say that we are learning Tiberian Hebrew, since we're using a Tiberian marking system. There are other marking systems, but Tiberian Masoretic Hebrew became the most popular. For just a moment, I want you to put aside this chart and just think about vowels in general. Think about how we use them in words, and now think what would happen if they weren't there. In order for the word to be pronounced, you would still have to pronounce the vowel, even though it may not be written. So think of English as though you were writing it without vowels, but then you wanted to add in some marks to show how the word was pronounced without actually writing a vowel. Now that may seem confusing, but let me give you an example of how this works. Take the sample sentence that's given here. This is an example sentence to read. We can see the vowels as they're given within the text. We know how they go together, how they're pronounced. We even know what to do when E and A at the end of the sentence appear in the same word, what is technically called a diphthong. Putting E and A together gives us E, not ead or eade, but E, read. Now imagine for just a moment that we took all the vowels out of this sentence. This is what it would look like now. And yet, as we look at this, we could probably still figure out what it says. It is not pronounced it's pronounced this is the example sentence to read. The pronunciation of the sentence doesn't change at all, even though we've left out the vowels, because we have to have vowels within our reading in order for it to make sense. Only now you have to figure out what the vowel sounds are without vowels in the text. Now imagine for a moment that instead of adding the vowels back into our sample sentence, we added a pronunciation guide back into the sentence. This might look the same for this and is, because I is the pronunciation guide for how to pronounce I, but the E in the is not an E, it's actually an upside down E. Within our dictionary guides that we find in Webster's Dictionary, this is called a schwa. It's a sound. The same with the A and the E symbol that are combined together in the word example. We don't put an E for because that's not what E is used for in the dictionary guide. Instead, this Latinized AE symbol is the symbol for The same for U and E at the end of the sentence in the words to read. We don't have TO or READ. Instead, we have U with that little symbol and R with that little symbol, indicating the sounds U and E. So even if we didn't know vowels and had no vowels, if we had this pronunciation guide, we would still be able to read the sentence. This is the example sentence to read, reading it the way that it's pronounced here. This is the example sentence to read. This is how Hebrew works. There are no vowels that are given to us in the text. Instead, we are given a pronunciation guide in the text. What you are reading in the Hebrew text is a pronunciation guide for those vowel sounds. Interestingly enough, when you're learning modern Hebrew today, up through maybe the age of 15, you will use the pronunciation guide until you learn enough Hebrew that you no longer need the pronunciation guide. And then you will no longer see any markers for vowel pronunciation within modern Hebrew. Only little kids use them, and apparently biblical scholars. The result of all this is that the following verse given here, Genesis 1:1, could be read, Bareshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Of course, I know this because I know this verse. But how did I know that was the pronunciation? That's where the Masoretic marks come in. They gave me the pronunciation. Here is Genesis 1:1 with the pronunciation guide as we find it within our Hebrew Bibles. The markings haven't been given to us by the Masoretes about 1,000 years ago, putting down what was considered oral tradition of pronunciation into a system so that everybody would know how to pronounce the Hebrew text. Bareshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In fact, within the Hebrew text, not only do we have vowel pronunciation guides, there's also an accent guide showing us where we give the emphasis in each word, where we give the intonation as we're pronouncing each word. Thus, we're able to read the text the way it's historically been written because the pronunciation has been captured for us in symbolic form. This is the way the Hebrew text works, and this is why we learn the vowel symbols. We're not learning vowels, we're learning the symbols that the Masoretes used in Tiberian Hebrew in order to indicate the vowel sound. Of course, for simplicity, we'll simply refer to them as Hebrew vowels, but again, technically, we're learning a pronunciation guide. much as though we were reading the dictionary and our dictionary pronunciation guide. It just so happens this is the pronunciation guide that's found in our Hebrew Bibles to help us read the historical readings that have been true for thousands of years. Here are the vowel pronunciation symbols used within Masoretic Hebrew that we find in the Hebrew Bible. These vowel symbols, as well as the dagesh, the dot that's here inside each bait, as well as the pronunciation and accent symbols found elsewhere in the text, are all referred to by the term nikud, which technically means spotted. These are the dots or the markings that are found within the Hebrew text, helping us with pronunciation. Again, to make things simple, we'll simply refer to these as Hebrew vowels, although you'll have to keep in mind that these aren't technically vowels, but pronunciation or nikud, symbols to help us in pronunciation. You'll notice that there are three classes, A class, I class, and U class, based upon the historic use of the letter aleph, representing either an A vowel, an I vowel, or a U vowel. Even within the I and U, though, we do have E and I, O and U, so we have 5 types of vowels, but again, the 3 classes of vowels, because that was the historic way that they were divided. We have short vowels, changeably long vowels, and unchangeably long vowels. The changeable and the unchangeable will make more sense in a future lesson. For now, you just need to know that there are long and really long vowels. It doesn't affect pronunciation, it will affect the grammar, as we'll see later. For now, don't worry about this. We'll introduce these various types of vowels in the next few slides. Here are the 5 short vowels in Hebrew, keeping in mind that I use a slightly different pronunciation than Van Pelt and Pratico in their textbook. They are using the ancient Tiberian pronunciation, and even though we're using ancient Tiberian symbols, the most common pronunciation within Hebrew today is the Sephardic pronunciation. Sephardic simply refers to a region of our world, not to be confused with Ashkenazi or Yemenite Hebrew. It's just a style of Hebrew, but it has become the most popular in the university setting. Because of that, I pronounce the short A as the A in father or the O in bottle, as an ah sound, rather than the ah sound that Van Pelt and Pratico suggest. That means I pronounce the letter as patak rather than patak. I pronounce the E the same way as is suggested here, as the E in better, eh. Herik also has more of an I sound, a short sound, but I often pronounce the I as the I in machine, almost like a Spanish I, pronouncing it as a long E, Herik. Comets is especially tricky because here we have the comets hatuf, which is an O class vowel. There's also a comets, which is a long A class vowel that you'll see on the next chart. In order to keep the two differentiated, and to remind myself that this short O comes from the O class or U class vowels and is an O type vowel, I pronounce it as the O in roll. The long A gets pronounced as more of an ah sound, very similar to patak. Kibbutz is a short U, although the short U and the long U are pronounced exactly the same in Hebrew, pronouncing them as the U in ruler. You'll need to know the names of these letters because we'll be referring to them throughout this class, and you need to know their proper pronunciation for when you're reading. The book, Teaching Yourself to Read Hebrew, which has been a required text, is very helpful in teaching you how to read these letters. Here are the 3 long vowels in Hebrew. I use the same pronunciation as Van Pelt and Pratico on these 3, again keeping in mind that there is no long I or long U. Instead, those 2 vowels use a long E or a long O if necessary. This is comets, using the A sound from father, comets. Tsere is a long E, but it sounds more like a long A. Almost think of it like a Spanish E that comes out more as an A sound. And then holum, which is an O, the O in roll. Because of this, holum, the long O, sounds exactly like kametz hatuf, the short O, but that's okay because it reminds us that it's an O class vowel. Here are the unchangeably long vowels, or as I sometimes call them, the really long vowels. Sometimes they're called the characteristically long vowels. These really long vowels are pronounced the exact same as the long vowel, the difference being that there's another letter that is assisting. In this case, it's either a yod or a vav. Thus we get sere yod, which is still pronounced as a, segol yod, which according to Van Pelt should be pronounced as the E in better. I, however, prefer to pronounce the segol yod still as the A in they, since it is a long E. Hirik yod is pronounced as E, not as E, which is they, in the E type, but I, which is pronounced as E, machine. Holum vav is pronounced just as a normal holum, as O, and shurik is pronounced the same as kibbutz, where it's U, as in ruler. Again, we'll explain more in a different lesson what unchangeably means. For now, you just need to know that if you see a yod or a vav alongside the vowel, it's pronounced as a long vowel. So here is our whole chart: short, changeably long, and unchangeably long, and our various classes: A class, I class, and U class, which then divides up into A, E, I, O, and U, the way that we have it in English. Again, we have patak, followed by komets, and komets he, which is an unchangeably long letter. You'll notice that on the previous chart, we had an unchangeably long letter that either had yod or vav. Here we have a he. This is really not an accurate presentation of an unchangeably long A-class vowel, and I'll explain why in the next slide. But for now, you can simply remember that an unchangeably long A, at least as Van Pelt defines it, has a he, komets he. We have segol and hirik. The long version is tsere, and then tsere yod, segol yod, and hirik yod, pronounced as A, E, respectively. And then our U-class vowels: komets hatuf, which I pronounce as an O, kibbutz, which I pronounce as U, holum, holum vav, both pronounced as O, and shurik, the long U. Again, learn the pronunciation of the vowels, and learn the name of each vowel, and, most importantly, learn what class the vowel is in, because that will help when the vowels change. I mentioned on the previous slide that it's debatable whether or not komets he should actually be called a unchangeably long vowel. Really, the he is a helping letter. I say this because unchangeably long vowels can occur in the middle of a word, but komets he will never occur in the middle of a word, only at the end, because he as a helping letter is only found at the end of a word. We have komets he, tsere he, segol he, or holum he, as this helping he or helping aleph, if it's in the middle of a word, assists the letter so that the vowel stays. Think of it as the vowel being really scared and wanting to leave, especially at the end of the word. The mater lectionis, the mother letter or helping letter, comes along and says, "Oh, it's okay, mommy's here, you don't have to leave." And because of that, the vowel will stay. So we have the word Torah, which has a komets he at the end. If there was no he, the komets would be tempted to leave, and then we would just be left with Tor. But because the he is there, the komets will stay, giving us Torah, or Yivneh instead of Yibin, where the segol stays because there's a he helping at the end of the word. The same is true of aleph in the middle of a word. We get Paran, where the aleph actually goes silent and doesn't have a vowel at all. We sometimes call this aleph being quiescent or quiet. Instead, the aleph is simply helping the vowel that is there. So these are helping letters. It does allow the letter to behave as though it's an unchangeably long vowel, even though it's really not. The he or the aleph is simply assisting or helping. One final note when it relates to vowel markings. Within the Hebrew language, we always pronounce the consonant first in a syllable. Syllables do not start, technically, with a vowel sound. Of course, the exception is aleph and ayin, which technically start with the aleph and ayin, but since aleph and ayin have no sound, it sounds as though we're starting with the vowel. Here we have the word ruach. It starts with a resh, which is then followed by a shurik, which is where we get ru, starting with the consonant and then going to the vowel. If there was a patak underneath the resh so that it was ra, we would still start with the resh. The one exception is what's called a furtive patak, where a chet or an ayin at the end of a word closes out the word and causes the vowel to be pronounced first. So this is not ru-ha, this is ru-ach. Again, it only happens in a few cases, and you'll memorize these, for instance in the word ruach, meaning spirit, so that you'll get used to seeing it. Ruach, with the vowel before the consonant, only at the end of the word and only in certain words. Well, that brings us to the end of this class's lecture. I've thrown a lot of information at you in terms of consonants and vowels, so go back and watch this video as many times as necessary to solidify the content. There are Quizlets linked from the Canvas website to help you solidify this content, and there is also information in the workbook that will be helpful as well. Van Pelt and Pratico spent a great deal of time emphasizing transliteration. Transliteration, to put it bluntly, is flat out annoying, and most scholars try to avoid it as much as possible. For that reason, I don't expect you to know transliteration, and so you can skip all of the exercises in your workbook related to transliteration. Someday, if you need to know it, you can learn it then, but for now, just simply ignore those sections. Go and do your workbook exercises and follow along the video related to the workbook exercise. Once you have finished those and finished the Quizlet and feel as though you recognize and understand the letters of the Hebrew language, you are ready to move on to Lesson 2.